even the groups that have been most temperamentally least likely to look at Farage as the solution to whatever the problem is are now doing so, is a function of the fact that, the Tory government failed for 14 years, and this government looks like after 18 months it's already failing as well.
Hello and welcome to this special Saturday edition of Coffee House Shots. I'm James Heale and I'm joined today by the Spectator's political editor Tim Shipman and the journalist Sonia Sodha. Now Tim, first of all, there was a big article out in the Sunday Times last week talking about reform success among a territory and a sort of group which maybe hasn't always yielded results for Nigel Farage's various parties, which is a Mumsnet survey showing how well they're doing with older women.
Yeah, I mean, traditionally and, consistently, Farage has been a man's politician. And there's pretty much always been a massive bias with every party that he's led towards men, and particularly older men, that kind of beer-swilling, pub-going fraternity that thinks of him as a bit of a cheeky chappy who's challenging the establishment, and that's always played quite well. I think there's always been a fairly inbuilt scepticism from the female voter. There's been a big deficit, sort of 10, 15 points quite a lot of the time in his support. And this, Mumsnet isn't everything. It's not the sort of, they are not the whole electorate, but they're a pretty key sort of influential group, and it's a bit of a rite of passage for politicians to trot off to Mumsnet and, get a grilling and doing well with a bunch of people who are quite politically engaged and have a disproportionate tendency to vote. It's good news for Farage. I think there still is a male kind of bias in the reform vote in general. Young women are flocking to the Greens, but the fact that older women are now interested in reform, I think, is significant. If you went back to polling sort of 6 months ago, I think it showed that the only groups the Conservatives were still ahead with were sort of older people over 75 and more likely women than men in that category. I think it was older women were the only people voting Tory. And if that group is now pivoting towards reform, that could have serious implications as the year goes on.
And I got a bit excited there because I thought Mumsnet produced the greatest ever interview moment since Jeremy Paxman's questions about Richard Desmond's empire to Tony Blair, which was, of course, asking Andy Burnham what his favourite type of biscuit was. And
yes.
His reply was?
His reply, which I think may be the single stupidest reply that any politician has ever given, is, I don't like biscuits, but I do love chips and gravy. And yeah, I've always thought that was a pretty strong indicator of how cynical Andy Burnham might choose to be in his political career. And there was, it always catches people out. Gordon Brown, I think, took 48 hours to reply to the question and then gave an answer that was mildly equivocal and then caused even more fuss. So Mumsnet has the capacity to trip up politicians, and the fact that Farage is now doing well with them they'll be encouraged by that in Reform HQ.
I mean, Sonia, you've written about gender for many years. I mean, just to give some indication about this. I mean, is there potentially sort of Labour's flip-flopping on different issues around equality and gender that may be responsible for some people maybe turning away from them as the traditional party, where over the past 10 years or so, women tended to vote more Labour than Conservatives?
I think it's hard to put it down to a single issue. But I think it's certainly true that there was a group of women on Mumsnet who are really keenly interested in the issue of sex and gender and are looking what Labour is saying about single-sex spaces and whether it's going to implement the ruling of the Supreme Court last April that sex means sex and female-only services can't lawfully admit men however they may identify. So there is a group who are looking at that. The way I think of this issue and support for Labour is there probably aren't many people who would put the issue right at the top of their list if they're talking about how they're going to vote at the next election. For most people, whether they're men or women, that will be issues like the NHS, state of the economy, immigration. Those are sort of generally the top three. But where I sort of think the issue comes into play is really a temperature check on how you're feeling about a government and whether you can trust them. And I think it is an issue that Labour's got into trouble in the past. You know, we have the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, a few years ago, sort of getting into quite an awkward mess when he sort of implied that one of his MPs, Rosie Duffield, shouldn't say that only women have a cervix, for example. And there are a lot of women who are just a bit like, what was that about? And, you know, it really doesn't seem like they're that enthusiastic on the Supreme Court judgment around single-sex spaces, shall we say, given that Bridget Phillipson has been sitting on the guidance that would help organisations implement this ruling from the Supreme Court for months now. So while I suspect this issue in and of itself is not going to be driving big changes in voting behaviour, it's not going to be behind the drop in support that we're seeing for Labour amongst Mumsnet voters, and it's really significant. You know, the proportion of Mumsnet users who say that they would vote for Labour has gone down from in the 40s, so I think it was like 43% last year, to 18% this year. Really significant drop off. It's not going to be primarily driven by the sex and gender issue, but that will absolutely be something that comes into play for some women when they're thinking about, well, is this a government I can trust? Is it a government that adopts common sense? Does it get people like me? So I think it is an issue for them.
I mean, Tim, that point about credibility, I mean, obviously it's playing different sectors, but I mean, on this issue, we know for Labour it's been a key sort of stumbling block, hasn't it? I mean, there was I remember one interview where Keir Starmer's, I think it's April 2023, he's clearly going to become the next Prime Minister after Rishi Sunak at this point, and the headline is something like, about women with penises, and this was still for many months and years sort of the issue which Labour kept tripping over.
It took him ages to sort it out, because it's something that, you know, a lot of people in the Labour Party, a lot of people on the left, they regard this as a sort of absolute shibboleth that, you know, you have to accept the trans rights argument, and a lot of women on the left hold that view within the party, but I don't think most of the public does, and particularly not older women, and that's why this is interesting. And the stupid thing almost really is that, you know, the Supreme Court ruling was very helpful for those who felt that this was a way of parking this issue and depoliticising it and saying the decision's been made, we just need to produce this guidance. And it's very clear that Bridget Phillipson does not agree with the Supreme Court ruling, and that there are significant pressure groups within the party who don't either. Now, we have a hint of Starmer's sort of earlier opinions on this, but I think even he has realised that, you know, the vast bulk of the public thinks this is a sort of weird distraction, really. But I think Sonia's right. I think this goes much broader than just that issue. I think what this shows is just the sort of collapse in general trust across the electorate, and the fact that it's now affecting women who have been, you know, previously disposed to be fairly negative about Farage, that even they are now turning and saying, you know, perhaps we need to look at reform, because, you know, as Sonia says, the most important issue is always the cost of living, and the sense that, you know, you also want a competent government, and Labour have not really ticked that box very effectively. And I think, you know, people look at this government and think it's just sort of generally failing, and they don't have great expectations that it's going to turn things around. And I think, you know, so far Labour hasn't particularly even had good answers on the cost of living. There was some stuff in the budget that was kind of a retail offer, some stuff on energy and that kind of thing.
And rail freezes.
But even in, you know, we now look like they're doing a U-turn on business rates.
Yeah.
On, you know,
pubs and hospitality at the time of recording.
Exactly, to try and sort of prop up the, pubs and restaurants. And, you know, that's people, when they get upset about their own sort of community looking moribund, the sense that the economy is not going anywhere, they look at the high street, they look at their own communities, and I think the idea that they were going to sort of close down a bunch of pubs and restaurants was pretty damaging for Labour. So then U-turning on that, this is just, we can fall into the mistake, a bunch of political commentators, of saying women care about the public services and they care about childcare, and, you know, they also care about, you know, what state's the economy in? Is the government competent? And I think this survey, while there'll be some people who are driven by the incoherence of Labour's response on gender issues, and I think older women in particular regard a lot of this stuff as particularly bizarre and strange. Younger women who are flocking to the Greens clearly share the views of lots of left-wing MPs that we ought to be adopting all this stuff, but older women certainly don't. And I think it just goes wider than that. The fact that even the groups that have been most temperamentally least likely to look at Farage as the solution to whatever the problem is are now doing so is a function of the fact that, the Tory government failed for 14 years and this government looks like after 18 months it's already failing as well. And, it's not a surprise that women who are general voters as well as having specific interest in some issues are losing confidence in them.
I mean, Sonia, Tim talks there about this sort of age difference there. And there's been a lot of commentary around potentially younger men going to more right-wing parties, women going to left-wing ones. I mean, what do you make of that in terms of how is that going to be sort of playing out in our politics and the fact it's going to have on the next general election, maybe?
Yeah, well, it's interesting and it follows kind of I think it's best to call them indications rather than extensive research, but indications that, right across the West, actually, there is a gender gap developing between men and women, where there's a bigger gap between men tacking right and women tacking left than there has been in previous generations. And I think that is really interesting and a bit worrying as well, because you don't really want there to be, you want a healthy political spectrum, clearly, but I don't think it's a particularly healthy sign if it looks like men are going more one way and women are going the other way. So I think it is interesting. I think it's too early to tell exactly how it's going to play into the next general election. I think it probably relates to the more general fragmenting of the electorate that we're seeing, which is part of a rejection of politics as usual. And the way that Labour got elected in 2024 was to ride that wave of disaffection with the Conservatives. Now, there's already a big wave of disaffection with this Labour government. That isn't all going to automatically go to the Conservatives because they're only in government, just over a year ago. So it is Reform who is sort of riding that wave in the polls at the moment, and the Greens to some extent too, picking up disaffection on the left. So I think it's part of that trend towards people saying the main parties just aren't offering us anything. Therefore, we will look to parties that have never been in government and haven't delivered anything, like Green and Reform. And I think the risk is that actually some of those parties have got a really bad track record in local government, and it may fuel further disaffection with politics. Just I don't want to jump around too much, but just to come back on one other thing that Tim was saying, which is to come back to the issue of gender and sex and Bridget Phillipson and this guidance from the about the Supreme Court ruling that is being sat on. The other thing I think it tells us about politics at the moment is that we've got a cabinet who are really focused not on running the country and speaking to voters, but on the prospect of an imminent leadership election. And I really do think that is why it's an important reason why Bridget Phillipson doesn't appear to be doing anything about this very important statutory guidance on single-sex spaces. It's because it's a very divisive issue, as Tim says, within the Labour Party. You've got the unions who are against it, you've got young activists, you've even got backbench MPs who think that men should be able to self-identify into spaces where women are getting undressed. And I think it's a real problem for the party, and I think the Tories had this when they were in government as well. When things feel really unstable and people are unhappy with the leader and Prime Minister and they think that there could be a change, it means that the cabinet becomes very focused on internal politics and thinking about what they're doing might affect the membership of the party, which is a tiny group compared to the electorate, rather than keeping focused on voters. And so again, I think that's an example of where sex and gender is actually illustrative of a bigger problem for Labour at the moment.
Yeah, it's disproportionately influential, isn't it? I mean, this Labour government has three audiences: the public, the markets, and the Parliamentary Labour Party. And the order in which they ought to take them is some combination of the public and the markets, with the Parliamentary Labour Party in third place. The Parliamentary Labour Party is very definitely in first place in terms of most of the calculations that people within government are making. I think Sonia's absolutely right. I mean, it's easy to say, women are going left and men are going right, but actually the Greens and Reform's success is based on the same disillusionment with what's been happening over the last 15 years and what's happening now. These are just two different expressions of the same phenomenon, which is discussed with the establishment parties and what they've managed to achieve. And people find slightly different outlets for that. But actually, what Farage and Polanski are doing is in a lot of ways very similar. And you see this on the doorstep. You talk to people who'd actually knock on doors and talk to voters, and they will tell you that there are a lot of voters in this country who, if you ask them who they're going to back, are actually trying to decide between the Green Party and the Reform Party, or between Reform and the Liberal Democrats, which on the face of it seems bizarre that they have, but people don't sort of live in left-right kind of denominations like political commentators like to chop them into. They're looking for what's the best way of protesting against the stuff we don't like going on at the centre. And while Polanski's policies and Farage's are very different in some ways, the way they do their politics is very similar. And in terms of the votes they're attracting votes from people who are totally and utterly pissed off with everything that's happening. And, they're happy to choose whichever one of those things is likely to give the government the bloodiest nose. And that's really bad news for Labour ahead of the May elections.
Well, left or right might be more a question of insurgent versus establishment. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Tim. And thank you for listening to Coffee House Shots.